Hello, this is your host, Austin Hopkins, and welcome to the Introvert Leader Podcast. Welcome to episode 7, titled Effective Presentations. Super pumped to have you guys here today and talk about everything related to giving good presentations. But before we do that, I want to say thank you guys, and I wanted to just give you a little sneak peek to how things have been going with the podcast. So we launched it just under 60 days ago, and I could not be more excited to say that we've seen more than 1,000 downloads, and we've had consistent listeners in over 38 countries. So just let that sink in for a second. 38 countries across the world, folks are listening to the podcast, and I got to tell you, it feels amazing. Obviously, something's working, and the content's resonating with folks all across the world. I mean, I saw listeners in England and Ireland and Germany and Malaysia, New Zealand, Cambodia, India, and the list just goes on and on and on. And so I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you. Thank you for being an early supporter and an early adopter. Something that I've always prided myself on and in my life is being an early adopter, right? Trying things when they first come out, not being the last to try something. So I consider all of you guys early adopters, right? You're listening to a brand new podcast that's only been out for a couple of months. So thank you for making it a success. Thank you for telling your friends about it. Thanks for leaving reviews. Thanks for leaving ratings. Just thank you. Thank you so much for the support. I really, really appreciate it. I'm absolutely loving this ride. It's been a blast. So buckle up. We got lots more to chat about as we continue to go on this podcast journey. All right. So before we jump into it, I had to give a shout out to my friend Courtney. Courtney is a friend and a colleague for the last couple of years. And I recently found out that Courtney actually does music. So he produces music, he makes music, and we were talking about the podcast, and he actually offered to give me the background music for this episode. So all the music you're going to hear in the episode today is going to be from my friend Courtney. He goes by The Crazy 88. Make sure you look him up on Spotify. The guy has amazing taste in music and he even does a better job at producing music. So really, really happy to feature his work, his passion on the podcast today. All right, little update on me. Music-wise, I've been listening to an artist named Tems. She is this amazing, I'll call her an R&B artist who's got a melodic voice that just, it's speaking to me. I'm a big, big fan of hers. She's been kind of kicking off and getting more popular over the last few years, doing some collaborations with Drake and Future. You might have heard her on the song Wait For You by Future. Really, really good sample of her original song called Higher. So highly recommend you go check out the song Higher and Tems. If you want to just listen to good music that's going to get you in the mood for spring, summer, get you outside, get you pumped up, and create a vibe, Tems is where it's at. All right, so moving on, TVs and movies. I recently watched for the second or third time this movie called The French Dispatch. So I believe I watched it on HBO Max, and it's by a director called Wes Anderson, and he's done some obviously really, really famous movies that I'm sure you guys have heard at, Grand Budapest Hotel, Moonrise Kingdom, Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou, I believe is his. So, quite a few really kind of artsy, weird movies, but they're amazing. So if you haven't watched any of his movies or if you haven't watched The French Dispatch, I'd recommend watching it. It's a good time, stacked full of great actors. And he just has a way, Wes Anderson has a way of making the movie very, very interesting and different from anything else I'm really seeing on TV and movies right now. So highly recommend checking that movie out. And then hobbies, nothing interesting this week. For the first time, I own a home with a lawn. So I've always owned like townhomes or condos before. So this is my first home with a lawn, and I've just been kind of nerding out on lawn care. So I'm gonna say right now, the lawn doesn't look great, folks. We're working on it. We're trying to get it looking like a real lawn and not a pit in the back of the house. So we've been working on that, been riding the bike a lot, but honestly just been working on the podcast a lot and also been diving into that new business idea I had. So I've been putting a lot more work into that and things are looking good. So, we may just launch this thing here in the next month or so. So more to come on that. But that's kind of what's been going on with me personally. All right. So I want to transition and kind of set up what we're going to be talking about today. So I want to talk about giving effective presentations. So virtually every person at some point in their life will either be responsible to give a presentation, or at least at minimum, everyone's going to witness a presentation in their career, right? That's just something we've all seen or are going to see. And I believe one of the things that kind of have allowed me to stand out against my peers is my ability to give really good presentations. And I think when you give really good presentations at work or church or personal life, wherever it may be, for that matter, it does some cool things. One, it shows others that you're maybe a subject matter expert, right? Also gives you exposure to new folks. So for me, it's been exposure to new leaders and senior leaders within the organizations that I've worked at. And it also helped set me up for being kind of the first person they think of when they do new projects in the future, right? Because they were able to see my ability to execute a presentation and create a compelling deck and visuals, etc. So for those reasons, I think giving presentations is something that is really important for us to talk about. And what I want to do really is kind of just give you my strategies, the things that I've done over and over again, the things I avoid, the areas to focus on to make you stand out and have really good, effective presentations. Okay, I want to tell you a story. This happened a few years ago, and it was not a good experience for me, and it's about a presentation that I gave. So have you ever started something and then realized like 30 seconds in that you weren't as prepared as you thought? Well, I have, and it is not a good feeling. And panic sets in real quick, if you catch my drift. So this happened a few years ago. I'm working at a credit union as a leader of a high net worth banking team. At the company, we had a mortgage sales team as well, who I partnered with. This was a team that helped folks get their first mortgage, their second mortgage, refinance, you name it. And, the partnership was newer. So, anytime I was given the opportunity to interact with the mortgage team, I knew I needed to make the most of it. So, one day the manager of the team reached out to me and asked if I would come and give a 15 to 20 minute presentation to the team. And you may realize this now if you've listened to a few episodes. I'm an introvert and don't like being around large groups of people. And I also don't necessarily love being the center of attention up front giving a presentation. But, these things are part of life and part of your career. So, of course, I agreed and, asked, hey, what should I cover during the presentation? And the manager shared not really much. She just kind of said, hey, you can kind of share anything you want, whatever you think is important for the team to know. And, in that moment, I felt a little confused by the lack of direction, but I agreed to work on the presentation, right? And this is kind of where I made my first fatal error. So instead of, allowing the manager to maybe think less of me if I had to ask follow-up questions, I didn't want her to think less of me and cared what she thought too much and decided to not ask the question and just keep my mouth shut. And this is stuff that happens still to this day. So, I can't sit here and say that I've become, a complete pro at not worrying what people think, but I still deal with that. But this was a time where it got me into trouble for sure. So fast forward a week later, and I start working on the presentation, right? I don't really have a ton of direction, but I'm going to come up with some topics that I want to share anyways. So I plan to just kind of give them an update on my team. What was my team working on? What we kind of needed, ways that we might be able to partner better. But I really didn't know what that team wanted to hear about, right? And again, I was too embarrassed to go back and ask. So I just kind of marched forward. And for some reason, I spent way less time than normal creating the presentation. I don't know, maybe I felt like the manager wasn't taking it seriously, or maybe I felt like it was kind of just a informal meeting, but whatever it is, I didn't prepare as much as I normally would. Maybe I spent an hour preparing for it, which is far less than I normally would do. And, I was feeling overly confident, which is never really a good sign for me. When I'm in a presentation and I'm feeling way too confident, that usually is telling me I haven't prepared enough, right? And so fast forward to the day of the presentation, I'm feeling weirdly nervous, but also super confident. It's such a weird dichotomy between the two. But I remember walking into the meeting room, and as soon as I got in there, I was shocked, right? Because I was expecting just to meet with that team, but I walked into a huge auditorium that was full of not only the mortgage team, but many other vice presidents, directors, senior leaders. I even think the CEO had popped in for a second. So instantly, this added a ton of pressure in my mind, right? I'm like, who the heck are these people? I was not expecting this, but, so be it. Such is life, right? So I walked up to the front of the room and I started moving slowly because time started to move really, really slowly, or so I thought. And I got up there, and for whatever reason, even though time was moving slowly, I was talking faster than I have ever talked during a presentation in my entire life. And I was bouncing all over. There was no direction. I was panicking. And I talked about my team, and I tried to engage the audience. Nothing worked. And it was done in probably 5 minutes. I mean, it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. It was less than 10 minutes, 100%. And as I'm up there, my stomach is in knots. And I started sweating. But TMI here, but I started sweating way more than a normal person should be sweating because I was so nervous, right? No one is nodding their head. There doesn't seem to be any kind of engagement from the audience. And I'm sweating so much that my face and scalp is beating the sweat and it's falling off my face onto my suit jacket. And I kid you not, by the end of this presentation, my confidence was shattered, and worse, my jacket looked like I had just been in a rainstorm. So I scurried off stage with my tail between my legs and just started to think back what went wrong. What the heck happened, Austin? And this was a low day for me, right? Because I always prided myself on giving really good presentations, being prepared, standing out. But I learned two things, I guess, in this situation. One was always get the clarity on the purpose of the presentation. What's the content going to be about? And next time, I'm going to make sure that I prepare no matter what. Even if I think it's an informal meeting, I'm going to over-prepare. So I tell you that story just to show you that bad presentations happen for everybody. I don't care if you're the best at giving presentations. You're going to have some bad days. You're going to have some times where you mess up. And that's okay, right? The key here, and I hope you're hearing this in all of the different episodes, is mistakes are okay as long as you learn from them. If you keep making the same mistake over and over again, you're not learning, and that's just, I don't know, immaturity, laziness, whatever you want to call it. But if you're making mistakes and you're learning and you're growing and you're hopefully not making those mistakes again, that's growth. And I don't think there's anything to be ashamed about when it comes to growth. All right, so I told you about my horrible presentation story, but I want to kind of break down the things that I've learned to really make good presentations. So I've kind of broken it down into three sections. One would be kind of the pre-presentation, right, before the actual day of. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what you're actually going to do during the presentation to make sure it's just effective and stands out. And then I like to talk about how do you kind of wrap up a presentation? What does it look like post-presentation? So we'll kick things off in the beginning, right? So what does it look like to kind of get yourself in the mindset of doing a really good presentation that captivates the audience, that gets people engaged? So I'll start with kind of the meeting logistics, right? So it's going to look different if you're in person or if you're doing video conferencing. So here are some of the things that I always do when it comes to logistics. And I believe if you're planning these things up front, that means the day of, you're not going to have to be scurrying around worrying about if things are set up, right? You get all these things done in advance. You test them out so that the day of, you're ready to go. You get to focus just on the presentation and you're not worried about all these other little things. So kick things off in person. Number one, I always confirm that the room is booked in advance. I make sure that the room is booked, that it's got the right technology in there. Does it have a computer for me? Does it have a projector or, does it have a TV that I can sync with? Whatever it looks like, I want to make sure that room's booked in advance, and I want to make sure the technology is working. So I usually show up to those rooms maybe 10 or 15 minutes early. I'll plug in my computer. I'll actually kind of just make sure things are working. If somebody's calling in, I'm going to test out the audio. Again, it just makes me feel better so that when the presentation happens, I don't have to spend 2 minutes trying to fix things, which if you've ever been a part of a presentation and something's not working for the person in the first couple of minutes, there is nothing worse that can suck the energy out of a meeting, right? Because everyone's pumped up, ready to go. And then, oh, sorry, the TV's not working. Or, oh, I'm so sorry, the room wasn't booked properly, whatever it is. So that's what I always do if it's an in-person meeting. So if it's a video meeting, right, a Google Meet, a Zoom, a WebEx, whatever it is, here are the things that I always do to make sure that I'm set up for success. Number one, 10 minutes early, make sure that the audio is working. Try my camera, make sure that I'm showing up on camera. I try sharing the deck. This is something that people struggle with, is they don't know how to share their deck in real time. And sometimes it'll take them 5 minutes, it seems like, to get their deck working. So I'll make sure as well that I'm in a private meeting space, right? If I'm doing a presentation, I don't want anybody around. I don't want to be distracted. If anyone says anything to me, walks by me, if I hear the dogs barking, whatever it is, if I'm at home, I don't want to be distracted. So I always make sure I try to book a private space as possible. I want to make sure I'm dressed appropriately as well. I was never a fan of dressing up and wearing a three-piece suit to work. I believe it's far more important about the value add versus about what you wear. But I do think that you got to obviously dress appropriately, right? So maybe you put on a collared shirt, whatever it is, nice sweater, doesn't matter. Just make sure you're dressed appropriately. And then I was always a big believer of being on camera. If I'm giving a presentation, I want people to see my face. I want people to see my emotions and where I lean in and get more excited about things and where I move faster, whatever it is. I want them to see what that looks like for me because it's going to help them be better engaged. So those are kind of some of the things that I would always do to make sure that the meeting logistics are ready to go and those aren't going to suck the energy out of my presentation. Okay, next one is kind of a really, really easy one, and it will save you a lot of time. So this is something that I have tried to do, I should say, over the last few years, is always making sure that I have content alignment. So what I always like to do is confirm with the audience or host what the content I plan to share ahead of the meeting. So I'll send them an email or talk with them, just say, hey, here are the 2 or 3 things I'm thinking of talking about. And that gives them an opportunity up front to say, hey, you know what? I don't know if I love that content, or reaffirm that, hey, this is great. So I get some clarity right up front. I'm making sure I'm not wasting my time and that they're not surprised the day of. The other thing I always do is I always like to send the deck. If I'm going to be presenting a PowerPoint deck or a Google slide deck, I like to send that to the host a few days before the meeting or at minimum 24 hours before. Again, gives them one more opportunity to see the deck. Maybe they have a question. Maybe they catch an error, right? Who knows? But gives them an opportunity to see it so that, again, no surprises on the day of. Because there's nothing worse than having somebody come in and do a presentation and they're talking about stuff you don't agree with or that doesn't apply to your team. So really helps kind of avoid those things. Okay, so now that we talked about content alignment, meeting logistics, I want to talk about how do you prepare. So a couple things that you can do to make sure that you have really, really good presentations and that you're prepared. Number one, make sure that you have the right content, right? I want to talk about knowing your audience. So it's so important to make sure that when you're creating a presentation, you're not just creating a presentation that you think you'd enjoy or that one person in the room would enjoy, but you want to make sure that you're tailoring the content exactly to the audience. So make sure that your content is relevant to their perspective. And I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm meeting with a whole bunch of senior leaders and executives, right? And I'm meeting with them about a new tool, right? That we've just launched. And I want to talk about user adoption and I want to talk about the different errors and things that we found. I'm going to make sure to keep that presentation as high level as possible, right? I'm going to include data and graphs if I can, but this is not going to be the minutia, small, micro details because that audience doesn't necessarily care about that and doesn't have the time for that. So really make sure that you put yourself in their shoes as you're creating your content. What did they want to hear? What would be important for them to hear in their role to make decisions? How can I make sure to keep them engaged, right? Is this too much information for them? Is this too little information for them? So really spend time focusing on your content. And something that I always do is if you are going to be meeting with a senior leader or an executive team, I always made sure to not include overly negative content. Now, I'm not saying lie and I'm not saying deceive, but what I am saying is if there's content you can not include that's not relevant for them that may be negative, maybe choose not to include that. Maybe just choose to include the important stuff, right? Be real, be authentic, but also know that you're trying to send them a message. And if it's just an overly complaining, negative presentation, you're not going to keep your audience, right? That's just not going to work. So, okay, now that we talked a little bit about your content, knowing your audience, I want to transition, talk about the next thing that really is important for me. And this is the deck. So if you're going to use, visuals, you're going to want to make sure that the deck is looking good. Right? So I want to make sure that you guys are spending time on that. So that doesn't mean, you just spend a couple of minutes on it, throw some words on a slide and move on. You really want to dive into that deck because this is just as important in some cases as what you're saying. Most of the time, the most important thing is what you're saying, but the deck sometimes can be really, really important, right? If folks need to see detailed information, etc. So here's what I do to make sure that I always have really, really good visuals. So number one, here's my process. When I'm starting a presentation, This always works for me. I basically go and I create a whole bunch of blank slides. And then I put in slide titles of all of the key information that I want to cover, right? So I will literally just write in the title of these slides. So maybe I've created 10 slides and I put in a title, right? 10 different titles of the different slides. So right there, that starts to help me plan. Okay, these are the big rocks. These are the big important things that I want to talk about. And then from there, what I start to do is slowly add in content related to each of those slides. Right? So I think sometimes people kind of get overwhelmed. They don't know where to start. What do I do for these slides? I don't know where to put stuff. Should I put all the detail in first? For me, it never worked that way. So I always started with a high level rough draft, blank slides, titles only. Then I started putting in content. And as you put in content, there's really two goals that I think you should have for each slide. Number one, only include the most important written information that you have to. Don't put in any information that's not important, right? That's not the place for it. You can talk to that kind of stuff if you need to. You only want to have the stuff that you want them to physically read, to really resonate and think about. And then number two, make the slide as easy to read as possible. So the things that I do to make sure that happens is I use uniform fonts, uniform text size. I do use graphics, right? Sometimes clip art, sometimes an image, a stock image. And a lot of times I do that with slides because it breaks up just the words. It gives people a little bit of breathing room to kind of relax as they read the slide and not just have to focus on, whatever the words are. So, obviously, like I said, use pictures, use graphs, use charts strategically to draw in the audience, right? Those are some things that really work. And something else that I always like to do as I'm designing slides is I like to think about how can I connect one slide to the next, right? So how can I connect those ideas? And it should feel like a story and it should feel connected, right? I've seen lots of presentations where they don't seem to connect. It'll be one slide and it jumps to something completely different that doesn't have any bearing on the previous topic. So find a way to connect those as you go. Now we've talked about the visuals, we've talked about your content, knowing your audience. I want to talk about the last two things that you need to do to make sure that you are prepared. So number one is practice, 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 practice. You can't practice enough. I'm not kidding. You cannot practice enough for a presentation. If this is important for you, you need to run through that presentation at minimum 4 times by yourself. And I would recommend doing it twice with others. Right? Go over your weak areas, go over them over and over and over again. If you stumble on something, redo it, start over. Some things that I've done to practice for myself, I'll record myself, put up my phone, and I'll take a video or just a voice memo of me doing the presentation. If you want to see where you need to get better real quick, record yourself. It's going to be super uncomfortable. You're going to feel awkward. You're going to hate it, but it does work. And then that leads me to my next thing around feedback and practicing with others. So something that I've always liked to do is ask a spouse, a colleague, a friend to review the presentation and the deck, right? This is going to help them, understand what you're trying to share. And they're also going to be able to tell you, hey, you don't sound very normal right now, Austin. You sound robotic, or hey, that sounds great, or hey, you need to speed up there or slow down there. They're going to be able to see from knowing you, do you sound authentic? And they're going to be able to give you some really good feedback. I'm telling you, this is like a golden way to get better in your career is embrace feedback. So embrace it with presentations, embrace it all over your career. Ask for feedback, give feedback. That's the way you get better, right? That's the key to self-awareness, I think. Okay, so we've prepared, folks. We've talked about the visuals, we've practiced, we've feedback, we've talked about the deck, all that jazz. The last thing I want to talk about in regards to preparation is that moment right before. Right? That moment right before you get on stage, that moment right before you start that presentation. Let's be real. You're going to be nervous. So just get used to it. That's okay. Some people are afraid of being nervous, it seems like, and they think it's a bad thing. The more and more I've learned about myself and the more I've read and content I've absorbed is that stress is our way of gearing up our body and brain to be its best, right? So when we're stressed, that's us being alert. That's us being on the spot, ready to go. We're focused. So learn to lean into the stress. Don't worry about the stress. But if you're finding that, oh my gosh, I'm too stressed. Oh my gosh, I don't even know if I can do this presentation. 3 quick things I always do before a presentation, and it seems to work, reduce my stress. So number 1, music. Bump some hype music, man. Put some tracks on that pump you up, that put you in a good frame of mind. Music has this incredible ability to change the way we feel. So use music to your advantage. The second one is I learned this trick a while back is that when we're eating, we are not as stressed or nervous. So something that I've tried in the past is eating a tiny snack or even some gum right before I do a presentation. And the act of eating something or chewing something, for whatever reason, seems to de-stress me. Because I guess back in the day, if we were hunters and gatherers running around, we're eating probably only at moments that aren't high stress, right? When we're not in danger. So I think maybe a biological thing has just happened over time. But from what I've read again, and from what I've experienced, this seems to work and seems to help. The last thing and the most important thing, it's all about your breathing. So 2 things that you can do around breathing. Number 1, you can always do the deep breaths in and breaths out, right? Deep. I'm talking, 10 seconds in, 5 seconds out, etc. Or you can try this new trick that I've been learning. I learned it from Dr. Andrew Huberman, who I talked about in a previous podcast, but he has this way of showing this breathing technique that will reduce stress. And I'm telling you, it's working. I've been trying it. So it's 2 quick breaths in through your nose and 1 long breath out. So it sounds something similar to this. And the more you do that, you're going to start to feel a little less stress. In fact, it's working right now. I'm feeling great. But if you'll notice, it kind of mimics what we do when we're crying. So if you've ever heard someone crying, they kind of do that 2 quick breaths in and 1 long out, just naturally biologically, their body does that. And it helps soothe us in those moments. And it does the same when you're stressed. So try those couple things out. Positive that they're going to help you manage your emotions as you're going into a presentation. Okay, so we've talked about how to prepare. Let's talk about during the presentation. What are the things you can do to stand out, to be really, really good in the actual execution of the presentation? So number 1, set up the presentation. Something that I always like to do, and I learned this from a really awesome coach named Stuart. He had this saying that he used, and I think it is a game changer. So here's the saying. Tell the audience what you want to tell them. Then tell them what you're going to tell them. Then tell them what you just told them. So we're going to talk about this today. Then we talk about it. Then I tell you what we just talked about. So they're getting the same message 3 different times. And it really also preps people to know what to expect so that they can follow along, right? They know, oh, hey, here's what he's going to talk about. So I need to pay attention during this moment. So set up the presentation, right? You're providing context to the audience on what they can expect. So once you've set up the presentation, it's time to actually start communicating, right? So here's some things that I do to make sure that I stand out when it comes to communication. Number 1, talk slower than you would normally talk and pause way more than you should, right? When we get nervous, we talk faster and we don't pause. We don't allow the conversation to just breathe, right? To have a moment of silence. Lean into those things. It's going to be more engaging for the audience and it's going to be easier for them to understand what you're saying as well. The next one that I always work on is you got to be a storyteller, right? People resonate with stories. They do not resonate with data and information. I'm just telling you that. Let that sink in for a second. I guarantee you, if you were part of a presentation a couple of months ago, you will not remember 1 fact or data point from that presentation. But if somebody told you a good story, kept you entertained, you're going to remember that. It's going to resonate with you. So be a storyteller. So bring the audience on a journey, right? Something that I've done is chronological storytelling. That always seems to work, right? Start with what happened at the beginning. What was the situation? What was the problem? What was the action that was taken? And where are things now? Or where are we headed? Or what's the plan, right? So bring them on a journey. Make it a story. Tell stories if you can, or just weave the information into a story. The next one is transitions. So transitions, this is a pro tip, folks. People who are good at doing presentations are usually pretty skilled at doing good transitions. So let's talk what I mean by transitions. So let's say I have 10 slides in a deck, right? And I have to get through each slide, but I also want them to connect, right? I want it to create that story, if you will. So here's what I do to make transitions really, really good. I'll say the last piece of information on the slide, let's say it's slide 3, and then I will talk about slide 4 and how those two connect. So I'll give you an example. Let's say we're doing a presentation around a new product, like I said earlier, that we're going to be rolling out, right? And so let's say on slide 3, I'm talking about user adoption. So I'm talking about how many people have used it, how often they're using it, how long they're using it when they're signed onto the tool, etc. And the next slide is I want to talk about system errors, right? So you might think, well, how does the user adoption and system errors really connect? So here's how I would transition between those two slides, those two pieces of information. So here we go. Now that I've told you about user adoption and how our teammates are using it, I want to transition and talk about the system errors that our users have identified. Okay, I'll pause there. So I just talked about user adoption. And on the next page, I want to talk about system errors. So I use the word users to transition between the two, right? So that's all it is. It's how can I find a way to connect slide 3 to slide 4 to slide 5, so on and so forth. If you connect them, again, it's going to feel like a story. It's going to show you put intention into your presentation and that you're not just jumping around sharing random information. Okay, so we talked about transitions. That one is going to take time, folks. You're going to have to practice it. And again, it's all about just finding the last words, the last few things you've said on the last topic and connecting it to the next one. That's all it is. So we've talked about transitions. The last two things I think you have to focus on when you're doing presentations in regards to communication is include clear call to actions and follow-up dates. You know, I've seen this so many times where people will do presentations and they really need something from the person they're doing a presentation for. They need them to follow up on something. They need them to take action, whatever it is. And they'll do the presentation, but they won't include any clear follow-ups or anything like that. And they'll just end the presentation. So then people aren't necessarily clear on what you want. So be clear on what your ask is and your follow-up dates, etc. And the last thing, it goes without saying, be authentic, be honest, be energetic, and be humble, right? If you're honest, if you're authentic, if you're energetic, and you're humble during a presentation, guarantee you're going to have people resonate with you because they're going to see that there's no ego up there, that you're just doing a job, that you're presenting information that hopefully resonates with them. So now that we talked about the communication, the last two things I'd like to talk about in regards to the actual presentation when you're in it is I want to differentiate what it should look like for virtual and in person. So for virtual, again, I'll say make sure the camera's on if you can and stare at the camera when you're making your points, not at the screen. So many people stare at the screen, they look at themselves. I'm guilty. We're all guilty of it, but don't do it. Look at the actual camera when you're making your points because then you're going to be looking in the eyes of the audience. And mute if you aren't talking, right? That's a big one. I think it's a no-brainer. We're all in the post-COVID Zoom era where we understand that the annoyance of not muting, but just mute your phone if you aren't talking. And then in person, the three things you got to do, eye contact is huge. So when I'm saying points in a presentation, I'm not looking at the whole audience. I'm saying my points to an individual person, then I'm moving on to the next person. So each person is getting a little bit, right? They're getting a little bit of what I just said, and it seems more conversational. It seems more intimate. And the last thing is, I know a lot of people like to stand up when they're doing presentations in person, and I'm not against that necessarily, but something that I've really started to do more of is I actually prefer to sit when I make a presentation. So I'm at the same level as everybody in the audience, and it's a conversation. People are more willing to ask me questions and interact, it seems like. So if you can sit down and make it more intimate, more of a conversation, you're going to have a better presentation. If not, of course, standing up is no problem at all. All right, folks, so we talked about the pre-presentation. We talked about the during presentation. Now let's talk about post-presentation. This one will be quick. Two things you got to do. You got to follow up and follow through, and you got to send a recap to your audience. So follow up and follow through. What do I mean by that? If you say you're going to do something during a presentation, do it. Nothing makes folks lose trust in you faster than you promising something and not doing. So if you say you're going to get someone the deck by the end of the day, make sure you get them the deck. If you say you're going to follow up with Susie by next Tuesday, you better believe you better do it. And also, the other thing is follow up on specific dates, right? So in the presentation, if you say you're going to do something on specific dates, that's better, right? Because it drives the momentum forward. Instead of just saying, oh, I'm going to work on it and I'll get back to you next week. It's like, no, I'm going to get back to you by Tuesday and then you'll talk to me on Wednesday. So you're moving, you're grooving, things are moving forward. And then the other one I mentioned was sending a recap email to your audience. This is big, guys. I would say this is something that not everybody does, but I always like to do, and it made me stand out. So something that I would always do is I would send an email to whoever the audience was, and it would be a quick email, couple sentences, and the first part would always be some gratitude. Thank them for their time. They didn't have to come to that meeting. Maybe they did, but they didn't have to pay attention, but they did anyway. So give them a little gratitude. Include some specific call to actions, right? What are the things that you need the audience to do and by what dates? And I always use the bullet point format in this email. Just keep it really easy so that they get this email after the presentation. I always like to do it within 24 hours and they'll have bullet points of the things they needed to do. This always seemed to really work and it helped helped people be accountable. And it also just showed that I was really prepared, right? And that I cared about this. So those are the things that I would always do post-presentation to make sure that, it resonated long-term with the folks. All right. I want to wrap up by telling you a story of a presentation that I gave a few years ago. And this one's different than the first one, the first story I told you. This one is a good presentation. So I started at a new company a few years back, and about a month into my time at this new company, I was asked to give a presentation about the status of a whole region. And this was called a BLR, Business Line Review. A lot of you probably know that term. And essentially in the BLR, in the credit union space, the goal was to give an overview of performance and trends and obstacles, etc. But at this point, I had never given a BLR presentation, and I was brand new to the company. And I also knew nothing about the region. So you can imagine I was a little overwhelmed, but hey man, I knew I wanted to make a great first impression because I know early wins when you're starting at a new company or a new team is one of the most important things you can do. So I knew I needed to get an early win. So I started preparing and I was giving the presentation with a colleague. So we actually, just decided to kind of split up the responsibilities and go to work. So I met folks in the region to gather, their input, and I started to work on the deck. Luckily, though, the company had actually had like a template that I could use. So it was kind of plug and play in some ways. So I could use their existing PowerPoint template to make it a little easier. But, I also knew that the presentation and the deck needed to tell a story. So I was like brainstorming, what is the story going to be? Like, what kind of story can I tell? I don't even know enough about the region to tell a story, right? I was feeling some insecurity, but just kept working on it. So what I did is I captured where the region was in a variety of metrics, what the obstacles were and what the plan of action looked like. What was the team going to do to see improvement in those areas where they were struggling? So before the day of the presentation, I shared the deck, with multiple folks to ask for feedback. I think I shared it with like 3 to 5 people, and I started practicing it, right? I practiced it in my car on the way to work. I practiced it while I was walking the dog, going to the gym. I recorded myself. I played it for my wife. I practiced and practiced and practiced. It felt like hours. And this was just for a short 20-minute presentation, mind you. And then I started practicing together with a colleague, right? And we practiced transitions and introductions, and you name it. We wanted to make sure that when we got up there, it felt like we were a well-oiled machine. So we were feeling good leading up to the presentation. As we got in front of the room, we noticed it was the region executive. We had a director, and we were feeling confident, right? So we started the presentation, and immediately it became clear that our audience was resonating with the content. We saw head nodding, we saw smiling, we saw questions. These are all really good signs to show that your presentation is resonating, right? And we told that story of what the region was working on, where it had been, where it was going, and really brought people along for that journey. So later that day, I received numerous emails and texts recognizing the presentation. And, the region executive even took some time to send me an award. And he wrote some words down, and I quote, they've always stood with me and really meant a lot. And he said, "This was the best BLR I have ever witnessed. The storytelling was amazing." And, to receive positive recognition from a senior leader at a new company I just started at felt so good. I can't tell you how good it felt in that moment. And I think the reason the presentation went so well really boils down to the key strategies I shared today, right? It was preparation, it was practice, it was telling a story, it was all of the things I shared with you that really led into that presentation being effective. So I'm hoping today you guys learned some strategies on how to be effective when you're giving presentations. All right, so I want to wrap up with a challenge. This week's challenge is simple. If you're giving a presentation in the near future, I want you to try to use one of the techniques I shared with you, right? Just try one thing, and I guarantee you're going to feel more confident. You're going to give a better presentation. And 2, if you don't have any presentations in your near future, what I want you to do is I want you to volunteer to help a friend, a colleague, a family member to practice their upcoming presentation, right? If you offer and they don't even have to ask, I'm telling you, it's going to mean the world to them, and it's really going to help them out. And it's also going to make you better as well, right? When we teach things that we can be better at as well, that cements it in our brain even further. So that's my challenge for the week. And again, I want to say thank you so much for listening. I gave you guys a big shout out in the beginning, all of you fans and supporters and listeners, whatever you want to call yourselves. I just want to say thank you. Really, from the bottom of my heart. Anytime you do something new and vulnerable, you're always worried how it's going to turn out and how people are going to respond to it. So to have this overwhelming support from all of you folks has meant a lot. So thank you so much for listening, and make it a great day. The Introvert Leader Podcast. Subscribe for new episodes every other Wednesday.